I don't see any words yet, other than the title.
No words there yet.
Nope. I mean, I don't see any. It's a rectangular purple box.
It's a very big rectangle purple box. That's the opening slide. I've just started recording, so welcome to everyone who's joining us now this morning and those who are joining us later as this is recorded. This is the Parish of the Good Shepherd in Waban. My name is Father Michael Bousquet. This is our second part of a probable 5-part series on eschatology, the 4 last things. And last week, it's already posted to our website, but you can review it. We talked about hope. What are we hoping for? And our text actually that we're as a companion text, I'm encouraging us to read is a book entitled Living Hope by David Jensen. This is a really, really great text. You can read it. It's a solid theological text. It's not something that you can read probably in an afternoon or should read in the afternoon if you could. Take your time with it, really delve into it. But we started out last week by talking about hope. What do we as Christians ultimately hope for? Where do we hang our hopes? And everything that comes in the eschaton at the end of time is really about what we are hoping for. And what we are hoping for, because this is Easter, is ultimately resurrection. So what does resurrection look like? And I talked about how there are classically 4 things that eschatology deals with: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And all of those play a part in our understanding of resurrection. So today, if you imagined where we're at, I'll make it my bit up over here, is death, right? That's where we're going to start off. So the question really is, what are we, right? What is this that can die? So here's a quote from 1 Thessalonians, and let me move my box out of the way because of course there we go. So may the God of peace himself sanctify you wholly or entirely, depending on your translation. And may your spirit and soul and body be kept sound and blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. At the end of time, right? This is an eschatological hope. And it's talking about us as we have a spirit, a soul, and a body. So in classical Hellenistic thought, Greek thought, pagan thought, people are divisible into 3 parts. We have a body, we have a soul, and a spirit. And Paul, in his letter to 1 Thessalonians, a Gentile community, right, is playing into this. It's speaking to Greek philosophy, what we are. We are spirit, soul, and body. And may God of peace sanctify us wholly in all 3 of the ways that we are, right? So that at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, we may be found acceptable and blameless. So the body, soma, right? Somatic, that's where we get that word from. Spirit is pneuma, like pneumonia, right? Breath. And soul would be nous in Greek. These are our 3 things. Now, how do these 3 parts of us relate? And what are the parts that are eternal and everlasting? Which are the parts that can die? What happens at death? That's really our question. So I have here 3 little pictures. Let's start with the one on the left. A tripartite nature. So human beings ourselves have these 3 parts: body, soul, and spirit. You can see the circle is body, right? And then in a concentric circle within that is our soul. And within our soul, we have what we would call our mind, or our seat of our emotions, our will, right? And then within that, we have spirit. It's a nice little conceptual understanding. How about if we move all the way over to the one on the right, okay? It's another little snippet, a picture of how we could describe ourselves. The same, body, soul, and spirit as 3 concentric circles. And it sort of tells you what the body is. The body is our flesh, right? It's our nerves, our brain, our organs, our muscles, right? And our senses. So our body is what sort of perceives the world around us. The soul, which we understand as having our mind, right? Our reasoning, our thoughts, but also the seat of our emotions, our feelings, right? Our dispositions. Also, our memories are in our mind. And our choices, our wills, our decisions, our beliefs, our attitudes, all of these things, the mind is in some ways different from the brain, right? The brain is made up of neurons and they interact in certain ways, but the mind is something that is greater than the sum of its parts, right? If you've ever gone into the philosophy of psychology, right? This is something that we would talk about. The mind is not just the brain, right? It's something more than the brain. It's brain plus. So the soul is something a little bit different from the body. And then of course the spirit within all of that is where meaning, purpose, and love resides. And if you go to the picture in the center here, you can see this is maybe a different way of organizing the self. And you can see how the body, which is that which relates to the environment, can our senses sense the environment, and the soul, that which relates to others, our mind, how do we understand the world, and the spirit relates to God. And you see how the soul is sort of this connector bit, right? The body can interact with the soul, and the soul can interact with the spirit, but there's no arrow connecting the spirit and the body. And if you understand that with the concentric circles as well, it's sort of like the soul is this buffer between the body and the spirit. The body and the spirit are pulled apart and are separate in certain ways. Here's other little snippets, right? Of all of these are images that I've gleaned from the internet. I've not created these myself. This is what you can get out there on the internet if you find it. But you can definitely see in this little pyramid scheme of body, soul, and spirit, right? The soul sort of is that bridge that links spirit to body. God is in touch with our spirit. The body is in touch with the natural world around us. And the soul is where it sort of all connects and makes sense, right? And then here's a sort of a horizontal progression. We have spirit, soul, and body. And this notes that the spirit and the soul are eternal, whereas the body is temporal, right? So the body can end, whereas the spirit and the soul don't. And here we have sort of prayers. I like, this is a nice way of thinking of it. Prayers to God emanate from our spirit, right? Whereas what I'm doing to you right now, talking and communicating, this emanates from my soul, right? My soul is my intellect, my reasoning, my emotions, my feelings. But when we pray, it's something greater than just our soul speaking to God. It is our spirit, right at the very heart of us, that is speaking to God. And of course, the body is this temporal, corruptible thing. And I like the first descriptor under body, right? What is a body? It is a physical shell. Now, the previous slide had an image of this, but when I was growing up, when I was a child, my Sunday school teacher said, "What are we, Michael? We are souls that just happen to have bodies, right? We're not this. This is not us. This is just a shell, right? A physical shell that will one day pass away, and your soul, your spirit will continue and abide. We are fundamentally spirits or souls. We are not this." And the previous slide, the image on the far right said, we are spirits who have a soul within a body, right? So it's sort of like what we are fundamentally are is that which is in the very center of the concentric circles, and that they just happen to have or are contained within the outer concentric circles within those images. So these are all different images of perhaps this understanding of the tripartite self, right? Now, my question is, does this make sense, right? This is something that is 2,000 years, it's actually older than 2,000 years old. Does it make sense to you today? Secondly, is it true, right? And actually, probably most importantly for us, is this biblical? Is this really what we find in the Bible? And the answer, of course, is always yes and no. We're Anglicans after all. We're both and for all of our answers. How is it not true, or how is this not biblical? Well, I said this is very Hellenistic. This is Greek philosophy, and we as Christians find our heritage most intimately, right, within our Jewish ancestry. Jesus was a Jew, right, and so Jesus would have understood himself through a Jewish context. And so what is the Jewish context? What is the Jewish understanding of the self? So The Jewish self is unified, right? In Judaism, there's a body that either has breath within it, has life within it, right? Or it doesn't, meaning that it's dead, right? But there's no dualistic notion of a person being made up of divisible parts, of sort of the body and the breath are sort of separate things. You are just what you are. You either have life within you or you don't. And the breath is the breath of God. It's a gift from God. God gives us life. But that's not somehow divisible from the body. So we have these words in Hebrew for soul and spirit, right? But they don't map cleanly onto the Greek or Hellenistic understanding of these terms. So in Hebrew, the term for soul, nefesh, right? It can mean a person, but it can also mean things like hunger or appetite or your throat, or even a corpse, right? A dead corpse is called a nefesh, or a soul in Hebrew. And the original term for spirit, right? We know this. We've heard a lot of this in our Hebrew scriptures. Refers to breath or wind, but more fundamentally to activity and vitality, right? And it's very metaphorical. In fact, it's almost always metaphorical when you hear this word rosh, and I'm butchering it because I don't speak with a Semitic accent. I can't get that sound to me, but rosh is metaphorical. Hebrew is a very poetic language. They don't delineate and define things the way that a Greek or Hellenized language tries to scientifically understand the world in concrete ways. Hebrew is poetry, fundamentally. So whenever you see rosh appearing in Hebrew, it's always metaphor. It's referring to something beyond itself. It's not just literal wind or breath. It can be, but it's always pointing to something else beyond itself. So we have Ecclesiastes. This is something that people often claim, Hebrew does have this dualistic notion, right? So Ecclesiastes 12:7, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it, right? So what is this saying? Well, it's not saying, right, that you have the body, ashes to ashes, dust to dust at death, right? And the spirit is something that goes back to God. This is sort of a poetic way of saying that after death, we stop breathing, right? And that breath is a gift from God. It's a gift that animates us, right, and brings us to life. And now it is gone. And that gift is returned back to the giver, back to God. We often in Hebrew scriptures talk about the spirit of God. And what that is referring to is the activity and vitality of God, that God is active and vital and present in the world around us. Right? So it's not saying that the Spirit of God is somehow different from the Father, right? So Hebrew, of course, is a monotheistic religion. They don't have a sense of the Trinity or even of the Binity, right? God is unified. And yet in Hebrew scriptures, we talk about the Spirit of God. It's not referring specifically to a third person of the Trinity. It's just referring to God and how God is active and vital in the world. That's how the Jewish understanding of ruach, of spirit, is interpreted in the Hebrew scriptures. So in Hebrew, there's this difference between what they're trying to describe as true and real, and really what they're emphasizing. So here's another oft quoted phrase. This is the Shema, the very famous commandment that Jesus uses as a summary of the entire law. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And by the way, when we hear the summary of the law in our worship service at Good Shepherd, right? It's drawn from the Gospel of Matthew. And we hear Jesus saying this summary as love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This happens quite a bit in Christianity. Christianity has tweaked Hebrew scriptures just a little bit around the edges. But your mind and your might are very different concepts, right? At least they are to me. Just be aware of this, that often when you hear the New Testament, the Christian scriptures quoting the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, sometimes they play around just a little bit. That happens frequently in our faith. And this is one of those places where it happens here. The Shema says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Now, that's not saying that the Hebrews, the Jewish people, believe that we are divisible into hearts and souls and strengths and might or bodies, right? It's really just a way of saying, with everything that you are, with your entire being, right? This is sort of a poetic way of saying everything. Love the Lord your God with everything that you have. Like I said, Hebrew is a very poetic language. They're not going to say, love the Lord your God with every fiber of your being. They could say that, it's kind of poetic, right? But this is sort of a way of talking about totality. It's not trying to describe sort of different aspects of the self that are themselves contained and separate, right? It's not a tripartite view of the self, but in an emphatic and poetic way for elements to stand in for the whole. So this is where we're coming from our Hebrew, our Jewish tradition. This is where Jesus would have understood the self to be. Self is unified. What are the implications for this then? There it is. Okay. Well, the first implication is there cannot be a person without a body. And that's big. That's really huge if you stop to think about this. In the Jewish world, the body is the person, right? And I said it can either have breath within it, it can have life, or it doesn't. But that's the person, that body, right? That's the person. You can't, there's no sense that the breath sort of persists and exists apart from the body. The body is fundamental to who we are, which is why in Christianity, resurrection always points to a body, right? The afterlife for us Christians requires a bodily resurrection. This is interwoven all within our New Testament scriptures, that the resurrection is about the body, because again, the first Christians were Jewish, right? They believed that the self was tied to the body, right? So the body that will have, certainly it's a real body, it has physical dimensions, as form, as shape, and it's got a connection to the past. It has a connection to the bodies that we had when we were alive, right? So it has the scars. Now, what this body will ultimately look like is sort of a mystery, but we understand the resurrection is bodily, which leads to a question about what would it be like to be disembodied, to not have a body? Everything that we talked about when I first started this presentation, sort of the tripartite Hellenistic view of the self, that there's a body, there's a soul, and there's a spirit, and the body can die. It's a sort of a temporal shell, right? It can fall away. But the spirit and the soul are eternal and can persist. What is that even like? What does that mean, right? Now, I'm posing this question to you, and to you, Mary Grace, to everyone out there, because Christianity for the past 2,000 years has been living and breathing Hellenistic philosophy. So Paul was a Jew, but he was evangelizing to the Gentiles, and he spoke Gentile philosophy. And of course, the Christianity as a faith existed within the context of the Roman Empire. We very rapidly left our Jewish roots. And so the theology that developed over the 2,000 years after the foundation of the church is one that has understood the self to be a Hellenized self, not a Jewish self, that we can actually have these three-partite divisions. It's a massive development in theology, one that would not be expected if you were just reading our scriptures as they were. The black and white text of our scriptures would not point to a tripartite sense of the self, but it's the milieu, the world in which Christianity grew up in. All of a sudden, we now have this tripartite self, which has persisted with us through the Middle Ages into the modern era, which is why if you go online and sort of talk about, what is this, the self in Christian theology, right? You get all these images of concentric circles and pyramids and three ways of delineating the self into body, soul, and spirit. Now, the question for you is, does that work? Does that make sense? Or does a more scriptural understanding of the self, should that win out, right? all of this is a mystery, right? There's no way of delineating the spirit and the soul. It's not like we can, with science, determine where the soul is or the spirit is within our body, right? This is all a matter of faith. You either believe that we have a body, soul, and spirit, or you believe that we're a unified self, right? But either way, this is a matter of faith. It's not something that you can determine. So here's a quote from our text. This is from Living Hope, David Jensen. And I'll read it to everyone here. This is sort of critiquing the 2,000 years of Hellenized philosophy that have really shaped Christian theology about the eschaton, about what's to come. So the idea of the soul's immortality, the fact that we have sort of a shell, a body that falls away, and that we have now a soul or a spirit. David Jensen talks about the soul, but you could say spirit here, it's interchangeable. That there's this immortal sense of ourself that can exist in a disembodied state. That's problematic, right? He says, when Christians separate the soul from the body, they often value the soul more than the body, right? The soul is spiritual, right? While the body is merely physical and corruptible, right? Remember that image where it said it's a temporal shell. The body is a shell, sort of a container for what we truly are, which is a soul or a spirit, right? This split between the soul and the body, if accompanied by such value judgments, actually runs counter to resurrection faith, right? As a faith that stresses embodiment, right? Because our faith, our scriptural faith, is in this Jewish context, which values the body. Christianity would view the soul and the body together. They're one the same. They're unified, right? The soul is the life of the body, not separate from the body. As living beings, we are embodied souls or ensouled bodies, right? Made for communion with God. That's what we are, according to scriptures. And Christian belief in the resurrection of the body, then, right, is not synonymous with the immortality of the soul. Resurrection unites the body and the soul in a new life given by God. And this is where we're ultimately ending up. That, when we talk about the new heaven and the new earth, the new creation that is revealed in the book of Revelation, we are embodied. That's the goal. Our souls and our bodies need to come together in a new way. Which then raises the question, well, what is happening after our first death, when the body dies, and that end point, the eschaton, the end of time, when we have new bodies and our souls and bodies are reunited? What's happening in between, right? Well, because Hellenized philosophy has said, well, there's this soul which is immortal, people have posited, well, that immortal soul is going to hang around for this interim period. It can go to heaven, it can go to hell. It persists, it experiences the passage of time, right? And this is where all of this beautiful theology about heaven and hell and angels and the afterlife comes from. This is where the four last things are going to come into play when we talk about judgment, heaven, and hell in the next few weeks, right? It's really about what's happening between these 2 points, between our physical death in this life and the resurrection, the true resurrection to come, right? What's happening in this interim? If you don't believe that the self is tripartite, if you don't believe in a body, soul, and spirit, where the soul and the spirit are some sort of immortal things that persist through time after the body dies away, here's a possible suggestion for what life is like. We're living, and then we die, and it's as if we fall asleep, and then instantaneously we wake up and our soul and our body is together and we're at the eschaton, right? Now, there may have been thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years between that. But for us, there's no passage of time at all. It's as if we die and fall asleep and immediately wake up into a new creation and a new life, into resurrected life. Now, if you're really going to lean into the Jewish understanding of the self, that the body is us, right? That there's no sense that there's a disembodied spirit floating around after we die. This is what bodily resurrection would look like, right? When we die, this body ends, And then if we have faith in God to effect the eschaton and bodily resurrection, well, why can't God sort of collapse time for us so that we instantaneously become aware of our new creation that we're in, right? We don't need to pin our hopes on some sort of disembodied eternal spirit floating around for millions of years until we become embodied again. And yet, Christian theology essentially posits that very thing, that after our body dies, immediately there's some part of us that persists, right? That is still there and is experiencing the passage of time. And what does that mean for heaven, for hell, for judgment? And we'll talk about these things in our weeks to come. There's so much to unpack here, and I'm leaving it here, right? I'm not going to go deeper into it. I know people probably have some questions, but this is where we're going to stop our discussion today, and I'm going to open it up for questions, for comments about perhaps our understanding of ourselves and whether we believe that we are tripartite or even dualistic. Some people are like, what's the difference between a soul and a spirit? I'm not going to get into that. We've got our soul, spirit, and our body, right? We're going to be Greek dualists. Is that you? Do you believe that? And do you believe that still after my presentation? So I'm going to open it up to.
Could you put up that slide, Michael? I know you put soul and spirit together, but could you put up the slide that showed the three and it showed sort of characteristics of, or whatever, of soul, spirit, body? The one that said body is physical something. The next one, I think it had, yes, that one. I don't know. I mean, obviously, none of us knows because it would have had to have died and come back. So nobody in this discussion, nobody anywhere knows. But I would have to say, I don't. This really resonates with me. Maybe it's because another neighbor passed away last week, and 72. He's only a year older than I am. But I've just been thinking about these kinds of issues, and the spirit one I particularly like because what it makes me think of is that you might, if your body is sort of shut down, even those characteristics or the descriptors of the soul, reasoning and thought in your mind, your personality may not actually be there much anymore. I mean, obviously, I don't know where they went, but they might not in any kind of an active sense be there. But I really do believe that there's still an essence of a person, the faith and all that stuff. And, I had a friend who said that, and she said she'd heard this before. I had not, but I had a friend who said that, just moments before her father died, he actually kind of squeezed her hand, and he hadn't been communicating, for a while. And when you go, our son was in the hospital not a few years ago, and I mean, everything turned out okay, but it was horrible at the time. And I remember them saying, you should talk to him. We never know, like people might hear you. And sort of that whole essence thing of spirit, I like that notion. I mean, it resonates with me. Like everyone else here, I have no idea if any of this actually, works, but I love that way of looking at it.
Thank you, Dawn, for bringing this up. I thought that Mary Ellen would bring up this point because, Mary Ellen, you're very deep into near-death experiences, right? So this is what I will say, right? For 2,000 years, Christianity has sort of been immersed in this Hellenized, this Greek philosophy, this understanding of the self as tripartite. And it's kind of like the fish in the water, right? The fish doesn't perceive the water because that's the environment that it lives and breathes in, right? It doesn't understand that it's in water. It's just its existence. It's kind of like us with this tripartite sense of the self. This is what we live and breathe. And we're unaware that it's so influencing our perceptions, but it does. So when we have near-death experiences, right, we understand it through this lens of, the body is so close to death, it's near death, right? But there's clearly some part of us that is persisting and separating away from the body, right? That's kind of like what the near-death experience is, and you perceive another world, right? Some world that is not perceived through the senses of the body because the body is shutting down. And that is the meaning that we overlay onto that experience because we understand without sort of critically thinking about it, oh yeah, well, we've got an immortal soul and a temporal body, right? This is clearly what is happening in this experience is how we understand the self. Even if you're not consciously thinking of the self in that way, it's exactly what's happening. And this point of what about people who are in comas, right, or who are in vegetative states? We absolutely, this is our loved one. We need to say there's something about this person that persists, right? The body is functionally shut down, but my loved one is still there, right? And so we're going to say, of course, they've got a soul, they've got a spirit, something that is not the body, right? That is a persistent reality. And then, yeah, they squeeze your hand. Now, this is, like I said, this is the fish in the water. This is the understanding of the self in the world that we uncritically embrace. If you talk to maybe some Jewish friends, they have a very different sense of the self. And being a hospital chaplain, I've encountered both Jewish patients and Christian patients, even patients that are not Christian, but are sort of formed in a Christian context. They have this sense that, yes, there's something persistent here. In the Jewish sense of the self, everything is tied to the body, right? And death can be literal death. It could be literally the end of the body, but there's death that is more than just literal death in a Jewish sense. Any diminishment of the self can be a form of death. And for a lot of my Jewish families, families of Jewish patients, when they move into this sort of place of a vegetative state, or there's sort of significant injuries, it's much easier for them to say, my loved one is gone now. We're not going to say that oh, there's something in there that is persistent and we need to keep the shell alive. This is also a lot of medical terminology, right? The body is a shell. We need to keep the shell going so that the soul can have a place to reside effectively. This is not what they talk about. And there's much less medical ethical dilemmas within that patient population because their sense of the self is very different from our Christian sense of the self. And the Christian sense of the self, where there's a soul, right, an internal soul, has had ramifications all across our culture, right? So when does life begin, right? This is the right to life people, and whether you can be pro-life or pro-choice, there is something there that is much more than just a body, right? Or a clump of cells, that there is a soul, there's ensoulment. And that the soul and the body are technically different things. And so you need to protect the soul always. It touches on many different cultural points. I see a hand over. So Mary Ellen, not Mary Ellen, sorry, Mary Grace. Yes.
Okay. What I think I've always thought of in the space between when you die and 10 years from now, 1 million years from now, 1 trillion years from now, you're resurrected because you believe that that's going to happen. I always thought, rather than have it be a nothing, which I think is what I sort of heard you say in between times, that there was the soul, the spirit are there because there are those who remember that person.
Yep.
And that is what is in that, what I heard you say, sort of an empty space, a not knowing space, so that's how I sort of keep myself going.
Right.
That, okay, yeah, Peter's dead, but there's people who remember him and loved him. And there will be people who've heard stories, and I don't know how far out this can all go. But so that's where I've sort of that's where I've always sort of found my solace. Anyway, don't like thinking of this enough.
Right. Well, so very beautiful, Mary Grace. Thank you. Yeah. Hold on one second. Let me respond to that, Mary Ellen, before I come to you. So yes, in Judaism, that is a sense of resurrection, right? That we keep our loved ones alive through telling their stories, through memory. Christianity wants to take it a step further, right? We believe in a bodily resurrection ultimately. So the Orthodox position is that ultimately Peter comes back, body and soul, right?
But for a long time.
Well, a long time for the perception of people here on earth, but for Peter, it might be instantaneous, right? So it's not that there's a perception of time passing and I'm just sort of in a black void, right? For Peter, it's like, this is the end. And then boom, I'm awake and I've got a resurrected body. It's the eschaton, new heaven, new earth has descended, new Jerusalem. It's the eschaton. It is. It's the eschaton. Yeah. So that's, and I do want to uphold that. I don't believe Christianity, any form of Christianity, both Orthodox or heterodox, believes in some sort of like black void that we just go to. And that would be very sad, right? Yeah. But an instantaneous resurrection, perception, right? God is the God of the universe, of matter and energy and time and space, right? So God can affect whatever God wants to affect for us. And if it's an instantaneous resurrection,
how do we know?
How do we know? That's a matter of faith, exactly. So Mary Ellen, I know that you're championing at the bit, so go ahead.
Well, everything that you say actually follows everybody's NDE experience. And
Okay.
Anybody reads any of the NDE experiences, they're all consistent one with another. They have a different experience when they pass over and what they see. And there could be some differentiation in that. But there is no void. There is a body. When the NDE people speak, they say, one very good one to look up is Dr. Mary Neal, and she had a drowning experience during kayaking in South America. And her videos are fantastic. And this happened about 20 years ago. And it's a smooth transition. The body doesn't even know. Many of them say the same thing. The body doesn't know yet that they've passed over. There's this period of beginning to it's such a smooth, easy transition. And that's one of the reasons they say, don't be afraid of death. Don't be afraid of it. It's something that people don't like to talk about. It's a subject that people are afraid of. And they're all saying, all the NDE people say, don't be afraid at all. And also that they do speak of, and you're mentioning this as well, like with the body, that in this transition period, you are still the same. It is still Peter Barber. It is still J.J. Kaiser. It is still, you are still you. And that's what, and when Dr. Mary Neal speaks, and she has the most classic story, but she speaks so beautifully about it. She's a good one to hear. But she said, I knew I had drowned. I knew as a doctor that I was underneath, and I knew that I had been underneath the water for 7 minutes now. And then my body, I knew that my bones had broken and the boat crashed. And she understood that. But then immediately, for her experience, she was in the arms of Jesus. And she speaks of that so beautifully. It's just the most beautiful story of all that I definitely recommend. But everybody talks about love. And in this diagram that we have here of spirit, soul, body, when we do pass over, this transition is to a different place. It is not this planet Earth. And it's just all about love. Everybody consistently says that. So
what
I just want to.
Yep. What I will say to you, Mary Ellen, and it's absolutely correct, which is we should not be afraid of death as Christians because of what we hope for, what we place our faith in, right? In a bodily resurrection. This death and this life is one step in a process, ultimately to new and resurrected life. That's true for anyone. Regardless of the details of what we imagine the life to come to look like and how it unfolds, we should not be afraid of death. And I want to applaud that and point that out for you. And of course, why should we not be afraid of death? Because God is a God of love, absolutely, and a God who loves us. So thank you, Mary Ellen, for that. Joy or Father Jay or anyone else have any comments or questions?
I do not today. I'm
okay.
I like listening though.
Fantastic.
How do you counsel a Jewish person, their do you sort of help them get to
Yeah.
Christian?
Well, so the question from Mary Grace was, how do I counsel a Jewish patient? The same way I would counsel any other patient, which is, okay, you're afraid. At times in the past when you've been afraid, what have been sources of comfort and strength for you? And if it's been your faith, how has your faith been a source of comfort for you? And that gives them sort of a pause to step out of whatever crisis they're in, to think back, okay, what are the other times in my life in which I've been afraid and I may have found solace or comfort or understanding after the fact in a certain way. And then I run with that. So in pastoral care, it's never the time to evangelize. It's never the time to say, okay, well, you're in crisis. Do I have a faith for you? It's called Christianity. It doesn't work that way. And for many reasons, but especially because if you are in crisis, the way to get out of it is to lean upon what works for you and what has worked for you in the past, not some new fangled.
Do Jews who have near-death experiences have this same sort of sense of love and that the people who are, writing about their near-death experiences have?
Well,
Yes, there's a whole group. Michael, I'll just jump in. There's a whole group in the near-death experience. It's the Association of Near-Death Experience, International Association of Near-Death Experience. You can go online, and I've listened to a number of videos. I've joined the Boston area group, and I've been in on many discussions. There's one whole a group that are just for Jewish, and they address it within their own tradition of how to discuss this near-death experience that they've had. Yes, Mary Grace, they have the exact same experience that everybody else, even if they haven't spent their life. None of us have spent our life, believing in all this. This has sort of come out over the last 50 years, from books that have come out, and everybody is feeling that they comfortable and now sharing their stories. The one I'm afraid of is the atheist, not the Jewish person, because the Jewish person does come from a faith and believes in a God, and I think can move and understand this. When you speak, and we speak about this transition that we have, the people that I feel bad about are actually atheists who believe none of it. And they say, nope, this is it. Life is over. This is all we have. That sounds very depressing to me. I wouldn't want, that's not what I learned when I did philosophy 101 at a Catholic university. That would be sad to just, if we address that for a moment, Michael. The poor people.
Second.
Atheists who have near-death experiences, what is then the experience of atheists having near-death experiences?
Have there been atheists who have had near-death experiences, Mary Ellen?
Yeah. Yep, you can go online, Google atheists with near-death, and then they convert. They come back and they say, oh my God, how stupid I am, how wrong I am. There is a life. What am I believing? This is so stupid of me. I'm not opening my mind to further expansion. I'm being this, and there are scientists, rigid scientists.
So like I said, Mary Ellen, I think that you're really going to love our last two sessions of this when we talk about heaven and hell, because if it is the case, if again, we have this tripartite sense of self, and after our body, our shell dies and falls away, and our immortal soul persists in time in some other worldly realm, well, then we have an opportunity, right, to become aware of what the truth is. And this is what, when we talk about certainly heaven, hell, even purgatory, right, that there's in the life to come, there's this life now, this sort of life to come, the afterlife, whatever is preceding the eschaton, before the end in time, when the true the bodily resurrection occurs. What happens in this intermediate time of heaven, hell, and purgatory, a disembodied state? Well, maybe our atheist friends have an opportunity to learn and to grow. And then you have the question of, well, is hell, for example, presuming that they end up in hell, is hell permanent, right? Or is hell itself something that's only temporary? We'll talk about that when we get to hell. Now, I'm mindful of our time. We're 1 minute over. So any final questions, comments?
Just that you're thinking of 3 more sessions, the 8th, 15th, 22nd. Is that what you're leaning towards?
So next week, we'll talk about judgment. And then the week after that, I'm on vacation.
Okay,
And
so
I've
nothing on the
offered to
15th.
Father Jay to do this from my hotel, but he said, no, Michael, that's not a good idea. So there might be something else on May 15th, I believe.
15. Okay.
I should be on vacation. And then after I come back, there's 2 more Sundays in Easter, and we'll talk about heaven and hell on those last 2 Sundays.
22nd and the 29th. All right, well,
Yes,
thank you.
yes,
Then I
ma'am.
will see you next week, but not the
Yes.
week after.
Well,
Thank
but
you.
no, Dawn, just to be clear, there very well may be an adult forum. There will be an
Okay,
adult
well, I'll
forum
be
on
here.
May 15th. Father Jay will have a one-off, knock your socks off event. I don't know what it is, TBD.
Perfect. I'll be
Tell me
there.
about this as well.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
He's gonna cut in and cover all my points before I can get to them.
So I'll see you next week.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. So, but there are not many people, Michael,